Good afternoon. My name is Gianluca Baldassarre. I'm the coordinator of the Laboratory of Computational Embodied Neuroscience, which is part of the Institute of Cognitive Sciences and Technologies, itself part of the National Research Council in Italy. So our institute is situated in Rome. My presentation is about the question of what are intrinsic motivations. And the answer I will give is from the perspective of biology and robotics. The presentation is inspired by the presentation I gave 9 years ago in 2011 at ICDL. And at that time, it was focused on biology. Whereas the works I carried out later on also developed the concept I presented in ICDL in the direction of robotics. This is the overview of my presentation. So first, I will stress the importance of intrinsic motivations in general. Then I will address the main question of my presentation. What are intrinsic motivations in organisms and robots? And how do intrinsic motivations work? I will start from the distinction between extrinsic motivation and intrinsic motivations, because this is a major means to understand what intrinsic motivations are. I will consider this issue from the point of view of organisms, and also by considering this, I will introduce some ideas that are valid also for robots. It's indeed very interesting how intrinsic motivations are similar in robots and organisms. I will consider first the distinction between the two types of motivations from the perspective of functions, and then I will consider the mechanisms that generate different types of intrinsic motivations. And in particular, I will give you some examples from brain about the mechanisms that underlie intrinsic motivations. And then I will pass to consider robots. In particular, I will introduce the Go Robot project, which sponsors the research I will talk about in the second part of my presentation. And in particular, the idea that was developed within the project for which intrinsic motivations can generate skills through the generation of goals rather than directly, as it was thought at the very beginning of the use of intrinsic motivations in robotics. I will illustrate this idea with through two models, one called Grail and the other one called Agne. And I will draw the conclusions. So let's first start from saying why intrinsic motivations are so important. So the reason is that for both humans and robots, they can do something very special. In particular for humans, humans' mind is based on two major kind of things, of ingredients. So cognition, and on the other side, the hot part of the mind is based on emotional motivations. Well, motivations are two types. The classic extrinsic motivations, which are the common drives studied in biology and psychology, that have to do with food, with the satisfaction of needs, protection, sex, and so on and so forth. And on the other side, intrinsic motivations, which, as we'll see, have to do with the acquisition of knowledge. For humans, intrinsic motivations are also very important because they have to do with the development of evil, and especially non-materialistic directions of development, because they are related to the acquisition of knowledge. On the other side, intrinsic motivations are important for robots because they can support autonomous open-ended learning of robots, which means that robots can learn autonomously. And after they learn, acquire skills and knowledge, we humans, as users of the robots, can ask the robots to do things useful for us on the basis of knowledge they acquired autonomously, on the basis of intrinsic motivations. So let's start from answering the question of what intrinsic motivations are. And as I mentioned, I rely on the distinction between extrinsic motivations and intrinsic motivations. In psychology, there have been interesting proposals about what intrinsic motivations are. So the standard definition in psychology is that extrinsic motivations drive the actions in general for instrumental reasons. For example, they are directed to obtain food or a companion for having sex. Instead, intrinsic motivations drive action for their own sake. That's what is said in psychology. But what does it mean, actually? It's a bit vague, isn't it? So, interestingly, some early psychologists, for example, Berline was one of the first, proposed that intrinsic motivations has to do with the property of stimuli. For example, complex, unexpected, surprising stimuli, they attract our attention, they're our activities. Another researcher, White, psychologist as well, said that related intrinsic motivation to action rather than stimuli, and said that intrinsic motivations are related to the fact that we manage to do what we want to do. Other psychologists like Desi and Ryan stress the important aspects, the social important aspects in motivations, in intrinsic motivations. In particular, they propose the self-determination theory and the idea that, especially humans, they want to set own goals independently, and they want to be able to achieve them. So there have been some ideas, but they have not been operationalized. Whereas the research with robotics and computer models have helped a lot to clarify the concept behind the mechanisms, the function, the concept behind intrinsic motivations. So the perspective I will give on intrinsic motivations is first in terms of biology, but from the perspective of the computations that are done by the brain. So why is it so difficult to understand what intrinsic motivations are? Because there are some obstacles in the way. One is that to answer what intrinsic motivations are, one has to answer the question of what they are for, so their function, and at the same time, what they, how they work, so the mechanisms that are behind them. So both aspects are involved in defining what intrinsic motivations are. Another obstacle is that intrinsic motivations is not just one thing, but they come in different forms, and we will see them later. And also there are the elements of intrinsic motivations are mixed in various ways within cognitive architectures of robots and humans. So before going to the distinction of intrinsic motivations from extrinsic motivations, it's important to stress some preliminary concepts. So in general, what are motivations for? Motivations are at least 3 things. They're a criterion to select between alternative behaviors, so they can drive one behavior instead of the other. They can give energy to the behaviors that are selected. I will skip this part, will not consider this part of motivations. And also they can be source of learning signals. So motivations can generate the learning signals for the system to acquire new behaviors or new knowledge. What is instead irrelevant is as follows, because usually it's confused. This distinction is confused in terms of extrinsic or intrinsic motivations, because both involve external stimuli and internal processes. So it's false that intrinsic motivations have to do with internal things and extrinsic with external things. Also, they don't have to do with primary and secondary rewards, which is a very important distinction in biology and psychology, because both extrinsic and intrinsic motivations can produce secondary rewards, but they are the primary source of reward when they produce rewards or when they motivate behavior. So they are the primary source of value in a sense, so to speak. Another important element is the distinction between function and mechanism that I mentioned. I'm going to use a lot to understand what intrinsic motivations are. This comes from big guys like Tinbergen, an ethologist, and Marr, that you probably know, who proposed the theory about the distinction of function and mechanisms in terms of, with respect to computers, so artificial information processing systems, but also natural ones, whereas Tinbergen focused on the biological aspects of it, of the distinction. So a function is refers to what intrinsic motivations are for, the utility, in a sense. Whereas the mechanisms and algorithms have to do with the information processes, information processing, and the processes that allow that and allow to support the function of intrinsic motivations. It's important to notice that the concept of function for organisms derives from fitness. So saying that something is useful for means that it's related to the biological fitness of the organism, so survival and reproduction. In the case of robots, something similar happens. Function has to do with the utility that the robot can have for the user, and actually how it can satisfy the user needs. And the user needs, of course, come from biological fitness. So they're very similar. So organisms, they try to maximize, they are evolved to maximize the biological fitness. Robots are built in order to satisfy as better as possible the utility of the user. Note that functions are nested. So you can have a function that relies on a mechanism, but that mechanism can in turn be seen as a function that is supported by a lower level mechanism, and so on and so forth. You can go down, down, down. So a function supported by a mechanism which can be considered a function itself, and so on and so forth, until you arrive to some primitive mechanisms that are at the very bottom. Like let's say in the brain, you might consider the neurons as the very low, the ultimate mechanism, lower level mechanism, lowest level mechanism. But that's arbitrary. You might go even below the neuron, below the chip in the computer, and so forth. So what I want to say here is that functions are nested, like Matioska. So what are intrinsic motivations? I mentioned the general idea of psychologists that say intrinsic motivations are not for getting resources. They drive action for its own sake. What does it mean? A more detailed idea that I proposed in my presentation in 2011, of course, grounded on other ideas that were circulating at the time, is that intrinsic motivations drive the acquisition of knowledge and skills in the absence of extrinsic motivations, in order to satisfy extrinsic motivations in a later stage. That's my definition of intrinsic motivation. And I will articulate it in several different ways in the following. So let's draw a distinction between extrinsic motivations and intrinsic motivations. And later on, it will become clear that I, in particular, refer to a major part of intrinsic motivations that I call epistemic intrinsic motivations. And I will distinguish them from non-epistemic intrinsic motivations. So let's draw the distinction between the two along several dimensions. So they are distinct along these different dimensions. So extrinsic motivations in organisms evolve quite early, whereas intrinsic motivations appear later in evolution, and they are especially developed in more sophisticated animals, in particular mammals, and in particular in humans. Also in robots, the robots pursue a program to satisfy the user needs, and intrinsic motivations are being introduced lately in robots. So they kind of reflect what happened in organisms. In terms of functions, the extrinsic motivations serve the immediate acquisition of material resources, whereas intrinsic motivations, they serve the acquisition of knowledge and skills for later use, as I mentioned. In particular, the organisms pursue material resources later on. Robots, when they are driven by intrinsic motivations, they are driven to satisfy the user's goals, needs. Whereas when they are driven by intrinsic motivations, they are moved to gather knowledge and skills. And only later, these are used to satisfy the user's goals. In terms of mechanisms, extrinsic motivations measure the acquisition of the material resources by getting information about them, about how much the organism gets these material resources, by understanding what's happening in the body, or by monitoring what's happening in the resources that are taken by the organism. In the case of robot, extrinsic motivations, they can measure the level of accomplishment of the user's goals. For example, they are represented by rewards that are given when the robot managed to accomplish the user's goals. Instead, intrinsic motivations, both for robots and for organisms, they are based on the acquisition of knowledge and skills. So they do not look at the body or how satisfied the user is, but they look at another part of the controller, another part of the brain. So there are some mechanisms that look at the part of the brain or the controller to tell if it is learning, acquiring information. This is used to motivate behavior or to drive further learning. Okay, that's the core idea. So instead of looking at the resources as extrinsic motivations, intrinsic motivations look inside the brain or the controller of the robot itself to understand if it is learning or not. And given their features, they have a time signatures, typical time signature, which is different from extrinsic and intrinsic motivations. So extrinsic motivations, they go away when the resources for which they are there are acquired. For example, if you eat, first you are hungry. If you eat, hunger goes away. But then it comes back when the need comes back again, the need for that kind of resource. In the case of intrinsic motivations, they drive the acquisition of a piece of information. And when that piece of information is acquired, it becomes boring. So they go away for good for that particular piece of information, of knowledge acquired. So this is a typical feature, time signature of extrinsic and intrinsic motivations. The first, they come back, they go away, they come back again, and so on and so forth. Intrinsic motivations, they always need something new to work, in a sense. So, I just wanted to say that in 2011, I presented a scheme that was very similar to the one I just presented. So just wanted to say that this distinction, that's the slide I presented at the time, survived the last 9 years. So I didn't change my mind about that. And that's something good, I think. That's just an historical anecdote. So now I dive into specifying, into deepening these dimensions of extrinsic and intrinsic motivations. And let's start from the functions. Okay, so let's clarify a little bit better why they are distinct. So extrinsic motivations versus intrinsic motivations, what are the differences? Extrinsic motivations, they drive the performance of action. When something in the environment changes, for example, a piece of food ends up in my mouth, there is an effect in my body. So my homeostatic regulation, regulating mechanisms, they are affected. And of course, this might increase fitness. So if I get food, I get resources, my fitness might increase, but I don't know as an organism. But some particular homeostatic regulation that are changed for good, they can drive learning signal, or they can motivate to reproduce the behavior that was just produced. If they produce a learning signal, the skill, the behavior can improve, and later on, it can perform a better action, and so satisfy even better the function for the improvement of fitness. Instead, intrinsic motivations are not like that. So imagine that there is an action and there is a changed environment. There has to be a mechanism that directly drives the generation of, causes a generation of a signal that causes an improvement of behavior, then causes the better performance of the action. And there is not a looking inside the body, but just a looking inside the brain itself, or in the case of robots, in the controller itself. And the idea is that only later these actions eventually becomes useful to produce some useful effects on the homeostatic regulation and increased fitness. But the key point is that when there is the learning, when there is the motivation of the behavior, there is not a relation with the body, with the homeostatic regulation. Okay, only later there is. So why do intrinsic motivations have to do that? Why evolution put something like that inside the brain? So the capacity to learn or the capacity to motivate behavior, even though there are no direct effect on the body, but only later on. Because there are opportunities in the world for which you have to produce a long, long chain of actions before you get to the final acquisition of the resources or the biological benefit. So who can motivate these long chains of behaviors? Or who can motivate the acquisition of actions so that later on these behaviors, these actions can be used for biological fitness? There are intrinsic motivations. Intrinsic motivations are there exactly to allow, for example, a baby to learn for years before it can put its knowledge and skills at the service of acquiring food and surviving and reproducing. So as humans, but also we share this with higher, more complex mammals, as humans, we can spend a lot of time learning, a lot of our early life learning, driven by intrinsic motivations. That's the idea, that's the function. Now we pass to consider the mechanisms behind that function, starting from the organisms, but also considering robots, because as I mentioned before, there is a nice parallel between the intrinsic motivations in organisms and in robots. And while doing this, we will also see the time signature I mentioned before. Okay, let's start from extrinsic motivations. So fitness depends, biological fitness depends on survival. So things like staying at the proper temperature, avoiding damage, stay away from predators, getting energy from food, water, and so on and so forth. And reproduction, so finding a sexual companion to live offsprings. So homeostatic drives, extrinsic motivations, are there to allow, to push organisms to get all these kind of things. And to do so, the brain has a close dialogue with the body, the visceral body, not the muscles that allow, and the skeleton that allows us to move around, but the visceral body, the thing that is inside, that produces energy and that produces constituents of the body and the brain itself. So the mechanisms are exactly something, for extrinsic motivations, exactly something that allow a direct exchange of information between the body, hosting the homeostatic regulations, and the information processing in the brain. So the idea here that there is the body, I call it source component. There is something that is capable of, something in the brain, in the controller, that is capable of looking into the body and understanding what's going on. And on this basis, produce motivation and learning signals. I'll give very quickly some examples of this. First, of the dialogue between the brain and behavior. For example, dialogue between our brain and our heart. So the heart can pump the blood at a certain rate, and what it's doing is known by the brain through information that goes to the nucleus of the solitary tract, the parabrachial nucleus, and reaches areas such as the amygdala and the hypothalamus that has an interface with both the lower part of the nervous systems and the higher parts. So in this way, brain knows what the heart is doing. For example, it is using a lot of energy. At the same time, the brain can do the opposite, can control the heart through an analogous pathway that involves the dorsal motor vagal nucleus and the nucleus of the solitary tract again. And for example, if you see a snake and you are afraid, this can activate a reaction in terms of higher blood pressure and higher activation of the heart. And this for, let's say, regulating the internal behavior of the body. So motivation for regulating or for selecting a behavior. But as we said, motivations are also related to producing learning signals. And again, we have nice pathways that allow, for example, the amygdala and the hypothalamus to trigger neuromodulators that in turn trigger learning in the brain. So again, we can have extrinsic motivations that can have an effect on the learning of the brain. There is a particular class of extrinsic motivations, which in the paper I wrote in 2011, I call non-visceral extrinsic motivations. And they are motivations that are extrinsic, but they take a shortcut in a sense. Because they instead of going to look at what happens in the brain, they just rely on information that comes from special sensors. For example, that are special sensors that are evolved in order to detect biologically valuable things. For example, smell and taste. They can directly tell if there is something in the mouth that is precious, that is valuable, and directly trigger extrinsic motivations, without actually going to the body and querying the body. Are you getting energy? Are you getting advantage from the things that, for example, we are ingesting? So there is a kind of shortcut in this case, that directly can motivate or drive the learning of actions. Example of non-visual extrinsic motivations are, for example, sex. We cannot access fitness when we make babies, for example. So there are some special sensors that help us to have sex or drive us to have sex, even if we do not actually access the increase of fitness that we have. And the same is for food, because it's true that the brain has a dialogue with the stomach and knows the sugar level in the blood, for example, but it's also true that there are shortcuts as those as I mentioned before. So for example, there are some special sensors as the smell and taste that can tell that something good is going on and the action that we did was positive. And so trigger extrinsic motivations that then trigger the performance of good behaviors or the acquisition of good behaviors. Let's get to intrinsic motivations now in terms of the mechanism. And that's probably the most interesting part of the whole story, right? So we said that intrinsic motivations, they drive the acquisition of knowledge and skills. How do they do that? What are the mechanisms behind them? So the story about intrinsic motivation mechanisms is quite articulated. In general, there are subcomponents that are behind intrinsic motivation mechanisms, and now we will see them. And there are distinctions. In particular, from the literature, this kind of distinctions emerged. So the first is about epistemic intrinsic motivations and non-epistemic intrinsic motivations. The second is about different types of extrinsic, what I call here, epistemic motivations, that is knowledge-based intrinsic motivations and competence-based intrinsic motivations. The first are related to acquisition of information not related to action. The second is related to action. And the other distinction is between novelty and prediction-based intrinsic motivations. So that we have three types of epistemic intrinsic motivations: novel, prediction, and competence-based intrinsic motivations. And these have been produced by different authors. So the first one, I proposed it lately in a chapter book. And then the oldest is the one from Odi and Kaplan, distinguishing between knowledge-based intrinsic motivation and competence-based intrinsic motivations. And another one, I contributed to produce that distinction about novelty and prediction-based intrinsic motivation, which are often confused. Now, let's focus on the components of intrinsic motivations. So the general scheme that intrinsic motivation mechanisms follow. So intrinsic motivations, as I said, they look into the brain, or the controller in the case of robot, to tell if there is an acquisition of knowledge, if there is a component of the brain that is acquiring knowledge. The intrinsic motivation mechanism reads this happening and uses it to do something. For example, to drive the learning of the component itself. So there is a circularity here. In other cases, the learning component can be read by intrinsic motivations. There is an intermediate component, and then this feedbacks back drives the first component learning again. In other cases, there are three distinct components, and they do different businesses. So the first one learns. The intrinsic motivation understands that there is acquisition of information there, or knowledge, or skills, whatever, and uses this information to motivate another component. So for example, to select different behaviors or to learn. And now we see some examples of this, in particular referring to what happens in the brain regarding novelty-based and prediction-based intrinsic motivations. So the three major intrinsic motivations distinguished by mechanism are novelty-based, prediction-based, and competence-based intrinsic motivations. And they are distinct by along different dimensions that we now consider. Novelty-based intrinsic motivations, they are related to the fact that the system acquires a memory about something. So there is a magazine of memories. Prediction-based intrinsic motivations instead are based on forward models can anticipate what's going to happen. They eventually can measure the mismatch of the information between what is predicted and what is there. And competence-based intrinsic motivations are usually based on inverse model, and they are related to the fact that some part of the system, of the brain or the controller, is acquiring a capability, a motor capability, some capacity to do something in the world. In terms of the function of the source component, what the source component does is to store, in the case of a novelty intrinsic motivation, is to store information. In the case of prediction, but let's go vertically, it's easier, I think it's clearer. So in the case of novelty, let's characterize the novelty-based intrinsic motivation. So the source component can memorize information. The function of that is to encode information in memory. So brain is full of that. So memory is a major thing for the brain. So the acquisition of memory is very important. What is measured by the intrinsic motivation is the quality of these memories in the brain, or if they are improving, if I'm memorizing something and now my memory is better. And usually the process that checks this improvement is a process that goes there and measures the quality or the improvement of the memory, one shot, let's say so. And the typical function, so that in terms of the target component that benefits from knowing that there is an acquisition of memory, is, for example, to store in the memory in a better way. So, for example, something that is novel now has a bad memory because it's novel. I mean, there is no memory in the magazine. And so this can drive a better memorization, can drive, for example, can produce a learning signal that tells the system, now memorize what you're looking at. Whereas when there is something that is no more novel, then the memory shouldn't try to memorize even better, spend energy to memorize even better the item because it's already familiar. But the utility of novelty-based intrinsic motivations can also be in the to direct attention, to drive exploration, to form goals and other things. Okay? So not only to satisfy the function related to the source component. In the case of prediction-based intrinsic motivations, there is a predictor, as I mentioned, that formulates a prediction. And this prediction can have a certain level of accuracy, or it can improve in time on the basis of experience. And the intrinsic motivation mechanism is based on two processes this time, not one-shot process. So it can, it has to first make the prediction, and then after there is the experience, the prediction has to be compared with the expectation prediction. What is the utility of measuring this kind of prediction capability? To improve the prediction itself, because when there is a mistake, for example, an error in the prediction, the predictor can be trained, or again, for other purposes. For example, to pay attention to something that you do not predict well, to explore that something, or to form goals about that something. In the case of competence-based intrinsic motivations, we said that they're based on an inverse model, and the function of competence-based intrinsic motivation is usually to drive the selection or one or the other action so that it can be improved, can be developed, further developed. And the intrinsic motivation measures the quality of the different actions, how good you are at doing the different things, at doing different tasks, or can measure the improvement, the competence improvement. So how much this or that skill is improving in achieving what it has to achieve. And this involves several processes. We will see some examples of this later, also for robots. So there is a iterative perception action loop. There is the performance of actions. And then there needs to be a check of the success of the actions that you perform, if they were successful or not according to some criteria. And usually, competence-based intrinsic motivations are to refine acquired skills. So they are a bit simpler than the other ones. So now I give an example about novelty-based intrinsic motivations. This is quite clear in the brain for what we know. So this involves the hippocampus. So the hippocampus is the source component that can activate a lot if there is novelty, for example, an item which is novel, or even an association which is between familiar items which is novel. For example, a pigeon is not novel for you. Your desk in your house is not novel for you, but if you see a pigeon on your desk, you're probably surprised because, sorry, you probably perceive it as novel because it's a novel association. So the hippocampus, when detects novelty, a novel item, it activates via the nucleus accumbens, the ventral pallidum, it activates the substantia, the ventral tegmental area, which produces dopamine, which is a neuromodulator, very important for learning, which feedbacks back to the hippocampus itself. So the idea is that when the hippocampus detects an item which is novel, it produces a neuromodulator that facilitates the memorization of that item. So this is an example of the source component and the target component being the same. The intrinsic motivation reads the novelty of the item, the new item, or the familiar item that is perceived. And the dopamine is the learning signal that comes out of the intrinsic motivation mechanism detecting the novelty. And what's its function? To favor the acquisition of memories. Another example is less clear, a little bit more mixed. because it also involves competence, because it involves both competence and prediction. And it has related to superior colliculus. So this is an area very important in mammals, and also lower level animals, that activates strongly when the system perceives a change in the environment. For example, a light that goes on or a sudden sound. So it activates and produces again dopamine, this time through the substantia nigra pars compacta. And this produces dopamine, which achieves the striatum. And when this happens, the striatum is encoding at that moment, the very moment, the context, so the situation when this happened, and also the action that eventually produce the change in the environment. And the proposal of these authors is that these mechanisms allows the system to notice when there is a change in the environment, so that the system can form an association between the context and the action where the action that caused the effect, the change, so that the animal can acquire the association between the context and the performance of the action and the effect itself. When this happens several times and the system has acquired the action, then there can be an inhibition of the dopamine itself, so that there is no more surprise. So in a sense, in this context, the change is predicted, and so it doesn't cause dopamine again, and so it doesn't cause learning again. So this is a case of a source component in the brain, which is the superior colliculus, which produces dopamine. So the substantia nigra, in a sense, reads the fact that the superior colliculus is activated by a sudden item. And the dorsal striatum is actually benefiting of the dopamine to learn. And eventually it can feedback and represent the predictor that switches off the superior colliculus, so that it's no more surprised again in the future. I have to say that epistemic, there was a lot of research on this inhibitor. It was not possible to identify it clearly. I close this example by giving some ideas about non-epistemic motivations. And actually, these are intrinsic motivations that seemingly, for what we know, do not rely, maybe if we advance in our research, we will discover that this is not the case, but so far are intrinsic motivations that do not rely on a source component that learns, and so on the mechanism that I mentioned, which is very general, of the measure of knowledge improvement. And we will see clear example of this in robots later on when I talk about robots, because it's not clear if they're present in animals. So maybe in animals, everything that is an intrinsic motivation is actually related to the acquisition of knowledge. And so it's actually an epistemic intrinsic motivation. But for robots, it's not the case. We will see. So now I pass to consider robots. And this allows me to introduce a new agent, a new ingredient, important ingredient in the story, a new character in the story, which are goals. And this project, funded by the European Union, called Go Robots, gave an important contribution for this. So this was a project funded in 2016. The acronym Go Robots stands for Goal-Based Open-Ended Autonomous Learning Robots. And aside little details that were really appreciated, it still involves, because it will finish in 2021, in 2021, yes. It involves 4 partners. So myself, Kevin O'Regan from the University of Paris studying babies, Jochen Trier studying community science at the Frankfurt Institute of Advanced Studies, and Jan Peters studying robotics. So the project which is hosting the research, which is funding the research I'm talking now at the end of this presentation, is about understanding how humans and robots can cumulatively acquire multiple sensory motor skills by autonomously interacting with the environment. This is very important technologically, because if we manage to have robots that can learn autonomously, they can learn in complex environments and structured environments like this. These environments, they need autonomous learning of robots because they pose challenges that cannot be expected at the same time when we program the robot. Therefore, it's not possible to program the robots, and they should learn by themselves. Why is it important? Because once they learn to master an environment like that, we can ask them to accomplish some goals for us. For example, to clean the room or to tidy up for us, to build a structure. In 2016, when the project was funded, the state of the art on intrinsic motivations was based on the idea that intrinsic motivations has to directly be used to allow robots to acquire skills. Notice that now I'm focusing, and this robot focuses on the acquisition of skills rather than just knowledge in general. So it focuses on, especially on competence-based intrinsic motivations, or in general, about intrinsic motivations that at the end of the day allow to, at the end of the day, they serve the acquisition of skills, especially motor skills. So at that time, that was the solution that was proposed. But that solution didn't manage to produce truly open-ended learning systems. Looking at the biology, neuroscience, also some computational models, we came up with the idea that intrinsic motivations, in order to produce skills, they should pass through something called goals. So intrinsic motivations, the idea is that intrinsic motivations should produce the acquisition to support the acquisition of goals, and then goals should support the acquisition of skills. That's what we have done, we are trying to do actually in robots with the project. So what is a goal? Is an internal representation, internal to the controller of the robot, the future possible state of the world. And now the state of the world is different from that one. And eventually the robot desires that state, and so acts on the environment in order to change it towards the desired state. Goals are very important, and they can drive the acquisition of skills. In this picture, I try to summarize how the intrinsic motivations I've been talking so far with respect to organisms are useful for robots that have to acquire the capacity to act in the world. And they have to do so because later on, as users, we might come in and ask them to do things for us, useful for us. So this picture shows that the three types of intrinsic motivations we considered before, novelty-based, prediction-based, competence-based, they can serve some intermediate functions. Remember that functions are nested. So the ultimate function is to serve the user. Intrinsic motivations are there to acquire knowledge to later help the user to solve its problems. And did I say solve the user? Solve tasks for the users? Okay. Intermediate functions are there to allow the acquisition of knowledge and skills that allow the system to serve the user at best. Okay, and these are some things that are very important. So intrinsic motivations can support the exploration of the environment so that the robot acquires knowledge and skills by itself. They can allow the system to search goals, to self-generate goals by searching them or by imagining them, by marking interesting things in the environment as possible goals. And then to decide what to do at each time, to select the skill on which to exercise, to spend time and effort to exercise. And this produces in particular, the generation of goals and the acquisition of skills to acquire the goals. And can also be useful to solve the user's goals, the user's needs, when these are very far away. So the robot needs to do a lot of things before actually satisfying the user. Very similarly to what happens to organisms, as we saw before. So now, I quickly consider non-epistemic intrinsic motivations, and then I consider examples of these processes that I just mentioned. So non-epistemic intrinsic motivations are intrinsic motivations that do not rely on a source component that acquires knowledge, measured by the intrinsic motivation mechanism. For example, there are mechanisms such as the counting of the times that the robot encounters a given experience, a given state. For example, to allow it to go away from states that are already that have already been explored. This is very similar to novelty-based intrinsic motivations, but it's not based on the fact that there is a system learning, memory learning. There is just a counter counting the states, how many times you visit the different states. Another similarly not fully clear concept is the one of empowerment. So empowerment can be a source. What is it actually? It's an information theory measure of the variety and reliability of the states that the robot can achieve with its action. Okay. So at least at first sight, it has not to do with the increase of knowledge it doesn't have to do with the measuring of the increase of knowledge of a part of the control. It's something different. It's about counting the different states that can be achieved by the system. It can drive learning, so it's strongly related to intrinsic motivations, but it's still not clear to me how it relates to, if it is indeed an epistemic motivation, or if it is something different. So I just, this is a part of my presentation which is a little bit of foggy, I know. That's what I wanted to say, that non-epistemic intrinsic motivations are cases of intrinsic motivations not so straightforwardly related to the fact that there is a piece of the controller that learns and the intrinsic motivation measures the increase or level of the knowledge and uses this information to drive another component or the component itself. It's not so straightforward, more complicated. I'm still trying to understand them. So I have to move forward. And I want to give you some examples of the mechanisms that I mentioned before and how they work in robots. So I will present two examples of that, two examples of our models that we are using to study this kind of processes. So here we have the Grail model, where there is a robot that uses intrinsic motivations in order to decide which skills to train. So basically, it decides, there is a goal selector here that decides which goal to focus on. But at the beginning, these goals are actually are empty. They are not still actual goals. But they can nevertheless drive, if one of them is selected, it can drive the selection of an expert, which is an actor critic component, so a reinforcement learning component that drives exploration. And exploration can eventually lead to some interesting effect in the environment. For example, the fact that this robot moves in the environment, it hits a sphere and the sphere turns on. This is interesting. So the system starts to memorize this effect of the action, which was obtained by chance. And here is where intrinsic motivations come in order to allow the robot to decide on which skill to focus. It's learning processes. So there is a predictor that tries to predict each time that the robot sets one goal, how likely it is that it achieves the goal within the trial, so within a certain time, The predictor tries to predict the probability of this. If the frequency of achievement of the goal is higher than the expected probability, then it means that the skill is improving. So the competence improvement is high. Otherwise, it's not high, it's zero. Competence improvement is zero. So this information about which skill is improving the most can be used by the robot to decide, oh, well, I will focus on exercising of selecting this goal, exercising this skill that achieves that goal because it's improving a lot. It's improving very fast. That's how intrinsic motivations are used in order to select different goal and the skill to train related to that goal. Here I give a very quick example of how the robot works. So at the very beginning, it moves randomly. When now he formed a goal related to the sphere, it tries to achieve it, but eventually fails. And the story goes on. So if it fails to achieve it in this trial, then it will set another goal on the basis of competence improvement of the different goals that it has discovered in time by bumping into the spheres. And then when learning goes on, when a goal is selected, the related actor-kiding component can learn, and so the skill for achieving that goal can improve, so that at the end, the robot will be better in achieving that particular goal whenever it's selected. So here, for example, I show what happens if after learning, a certain goal is activated externally by somebody. So somebody puts electrodes in the brain of the robot, says, now you select this goal. And the related skills is immediately recalled, and the goal is achieved. So this is a situation similar to the one where the user comes in and says, asks the robot, now you achieve this goal for me. And you have to use the knowledge you acquired autonomously in the first phase in order to do that. So in this experiment, you can see that the performance on 2 spheres during the trials, it goes up. And then when you introduce new spheres, that can be turned on, or they can be introduced completely. They were not there. The robot focuses on them because the competence improvement related to them is higher than the competence improvement related to the spheres for which the skill was already acquired. Now we see another example. It's the last one, and with this one I close my presentation. It's about goal formation. And this model abstracts quite strongly on skill learning and focuses on the search of goals. So the model is called AGME, Active Goal Manifold Exploration. And it's about an algorithm that is able to discover the goal manifold, which is basically the continuous subspace of a large space of goals. Imagine that, for example, the image made of pixels. It might be a huge amount of image, but only few ones correspond to the state of the world. And the robot has to discover them. The algorithm works with different tasks, sensors, actions, so it's very flexible. And the core principles is that similar action can produce similar outcomes, so potential goals. And it leverages on the previously acquired goals and actions that produce the goals. You discover new goals. It's similar to goal bubbling, and skill bubbling are also different from that, as we will see in a second. A simplifying assumption on the first version of the model is that it starts from the same initial state. So there is an environment reset after each trial. So the algorithm works in this way. For each discovered action outcome, compute the average distance of the outcome from the other discovered outcomes. Then select the outcome that is most isolated from the others, which means the most novel outcome. So the effect that you obtain in the environment, which is most different from all other possible effects that you obtain so far. Then consider the action that can produce that effect and generate a variant of it and perform it in the environment. And this eventually brings to a new outcome that you can add to your repertoire together with the action that produces it. So for example, in this case, you have a simple situation where the goal is a possible position that the sphere, a little sphere of this can achieve in the environment. And the action is actually deciding an XY position around an initial goal. So it's a very simplified situation. And you can see that with time, the algorithm allows to discover different goals and to produce the actions that can generate new variants of them. And you see that the lighter dots are the outcomes, so potential goals, that are far away from the others. So they are on the fringe of this goal space. We tested the algorithm with different environments. I have to go fast because I am running out of time. For example, with a multi-link arm, with an action based on a segment, of movement segment that could move an object, or that could hit an object to make it change the color. Or we also tested with dynamic movement primitives having several parameters. And in all 4 cases, with different inputs based on image or position of objects and so on and so forth, we had very good results. We compared it to gold bubbling. You have to skip it because it's late, but compared to good, we had good performance in comparison with skip bubbling, sorry. And as you can see here, there was a good coverage. These are overimposed images, and there was a good coverage of the goal space in all tasks. And the performance with respect to skip bubbling was very good. So this is our algorithm, and this is skip bubbling. And it was good both when the system perceives the position of the hand or the position of the object or the image of the arm and the image of the object. So it was working well for different goal spaces, also the complex ones made by images. And in all the 4 tasks, it outperforms other algorithms. After that, we also had a second version of the algorithm where we dropped the assumption of the reset. That was based on the idea that we selected the goal couple, the goal action couple, not only on the basis of the fact that the goal was novel, but also on the fact that the precondition, the starting condition of the action was similar to the one stored in memory. So for example, if the system is here, it selects an action that was performed in the past in this kind of situation or a similar situation, not in a situation very far away. Even if the goal here is less novel, is more similar to the other ones than this one. So we tested this with this robot, a KUKA simulated arm that was that initially played with this object, and then later on was asked to solve tasks useful for the user. So this is what happens with a random exploration during the intrinsic phase. And this is what happens with our algorithm. So you can see that the exploration is much improved. And after acquiring the different goals, you could test the system, for example, asking it to push the object to a particular area, for example, sector 3 of the environment. And this was done on the basis of a planning, so not just one action, but a sequence of actions that was based on graphs and also on the fact that exploration actually moves the object in sequence. So this is the last part of my presentation where I show this robot that initially explores the environment and moves the objects in different possible ways, and each time records information about the effect, the outcome, and in association with the action that produces that outcome. And then after it does that for a long time, so it moves the object in several different places, we can ask it to achieve, to push the object in a particular sector. And so it can recall the actions and the goals that it acquired autonomously in order to push it there. And so we can see that it engaged with this part of the scenario, which is a bit more difficult, some difficulties, and then finally gets out of it. Yep. And so we help it a little bit by moving forward. It takes some time. And then finally, it managed to push the object in the third sector of the environment, which was the extrinsic goal that we wanted as users. Goal achieved. So I close by drawing the conclusions of my presentation. Intrinsic motivations from the perspective of humans, behavior, brain are fundamental because they drive the acquisition of knowledge and skills. Are a complex phenomenon, and we are starting to understand only now, lately, in the last years. Some epistemic intrinsic motivations have started to be understood, in particular those related to novelty and surprise, but other ones, I mean, there are other phenomena, other problems of the issue that are much less clear. In particular, competence-based God-related intrinsic motivations, we know very little about them in terms of brain and behavior. And all the intermediate functions that they serve, not only competence-based, but also the other types of motivations, we know very little. And also non-epistemic motivations, we don't even know if they are there in any case. Regarding robots, this is the last slide. They're fundamental for robots because they allow robots to learn autonomously in non-engineered environments. And intrinsic motivations are many. So the picture we have of them is still partial. And goal formation and competence-based intrinsic motivations are particularly important for robots because they allow them to learn to do things in the environment. And we usually ask robots to do things for us in the environment. Non-epistemic motivations are less clear than other ones, but are very interesting. For example, the notion of empowerment. With this, I close, and I thank you for all the attention, and I'm ready to answer your questions. Thank you very much.